Hello. Today, I'd like to talk to you about Jesus. Specifically, I'd like to talk about PragerU's video, Was Jesus a Socialist?, hosted by Lawrence Reed, which is intended to serve as a rebuttal to a lot of people's arguments that Jesus preached values compatible with socialism, and which attempts to argue that, instead, Jesus was a libertarian who believed in the free market, coincidentally just like Lawrence Reed. Now, I'm not naive here. I don't think that Reed actually believes a word of what he says, and I think that, like most PragerU hosts, he's just taking a boatload of fossil fuel money to try and help spin libertarian propaganda as common sense. We're not going to say, haha, don't you know Leviticus says you can't wear mixed fibers, and then have everyone stand up and applaud.
Touching the skin of a dead pig makes one unclean, Leviticus 11:7. If they promise to wear gloves, can the Washington Redskins still play football? Can Notre Dame? Can West Point?
Instead, I want to use the way that Reed is wrong about these matters as a way to talk about them, explain the broader philosophy he doesn't address, and look at the fundamental problems with his political ideology. And, while I know that PragerU debunkings are a fairly well-trod path, as the only left-tuber I know of who has been washed in the blood of the Lamb, I think this one's up to me. So here's what we'll do. I'll start with just tackling the major point of his video, then I'll move on to address the core issue I have with his argument itself, and for a closer, I'll try and explain what many Christian socialists actually believe. I'm not going to be trying to convert anyone or treat the gospel as truth, don't worry. We're going to be discussing the Bible in a historical and scholarly context, and this video should be accessible to you regardless of your religious background.
He said to the rich, give your goods to the poor, so they laid Jesus Christ in his grave.
So, who is Lawrence Reed? His main qualification seems to be that he's the president of the Foundation for Economic Education, a libertarian free market think tank. He has a master's in history, but as near as I can find, he's never taught history or theology, and his only writing on religion is a 3,500-word essay called Rendering Unto Caesar, which his PragerU video is adapted from. He's not the kind of person that an actual university, and not a YouTube channel run by a very boring talk radio host, would employ to teach you about the Bible, in short. But it's not simply a matter of ignorance, because when someone tells you,
read the New Testament, the plain meaning of the text is loud and clear,
they don't know what they're talking about. The Gospels contradict each other, they're dense with symbolism and historical references, and they're written for an audience in the 1st and 2nd centuries and thus assume a familiarity with their setting and politics that contemporary readers won't have. As a result of this, Reed gets almost every reference to the New Testament wrong, and when he's not wrong, he's lying. Now, my original draft actually had a point-by-point rebuttal of the way in which nearly everything he cited here was a lie or a grievous misunderstanding. That original draft was also going to be about an hour long at least, so we're not going to do that. I'll put the deleted content up on my Patreon, so if you want to see me destroy his arguments with facts and logic, give me $2 and you'll have about 5,000 words of fact-checking. Instead, we're going to check the one big argument, the one that Reed titled his original essay after. The rendering unto Caesar.
Progressives like to point out that Jesus said, render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. But that has absolutely nothing to do with high taxes or wealth redistribution. It was the seed for the idea of separating church and state. It certainly wasn't the same as saying that whatever Caesar says is his must then be so, no matter how much he demands or what he intends to use it for. So there is no evidence that Jesus was a socialist.
This one is a very complex passage which has been the subject of a lot of debate, so I'm not going to try and define a single meaning. Instead, I think that the ways in which Reed is wrong about this story are our best chance to talk about the ways he's wrong about everything else. Now, one popular interpretation here is that because everything belongs to God, we don't owe anything to the state, and that Jesus is trying to hint at that without committing treason. This is the interpretation a lot of anarchists and tax resistors stick to. But we're going to take Reed's more literal interpretation as valid, just to be generous. Now, when Jesus says this, he asks the Pharisees whose face is on the coin and what his title is. Here is a picture of the most likely coin in question. As for whose face that is, that would be Tiberius Claudius Nero, a paranoid and dictatorial emperor who had banished the Jews from the city of Rome, and who was infamous for carrying out purges of his political enemies and seizing their wealth as his own. And the titles on the coin indicate that Tiberius is the son of the divine Augustus and the highest priest of the cult of the emperor. The Roman historian Tacitus describes Tiberius thusly: "He was infamous for his cruelty, though he veiled his debaucheries. Finally, he plunged into every wickedness and disgrace. When fear and shame being cast off, he simply indulged his own inclinations." Tacitus also complains that, formerly, when the people had power or when the patricians were in the ascendant, the popular temper and the methods of controlling it had to be studied, and those who knew most accurately the spirit of the Senate and aristocracy had the credit of understanding the age and of being wise men. So now, after a revolution, when Rome is nothing but the realm of a single despot, there must be good in carefully noting and recording this period, for it is but few who have the foresight to distinguish right from wrong or what is sound from what is hurtful, while most men learn wisdom from the fortunes of others. Still, though this is instructive, it gives very little pleasure. I have to present in succession the merciless biddings of a tyrant, incessant prosecutions, faithless friendships, the ruin of innocence, the same causes issuing in the same results, and I am everywhere confronted by a wearisome monotony in my subject matter. This is what the state meant to people under Roman rule in the 1st century. Not a representative republic, not a bureaucracy, but a system of military governance beholden to a divinely ordained dictator with no external checks on his power. Does Reed truly expect us to believe that Jesus, in pointing out Caesar's face, title, and state-mandated divinity, is implying that the emperor is the head of a classically liberal limited government and endorsing small government libertarianism? Does Reed actually believe that Jesus holding up a coin and reminding the assembled viewers that they are ruled by a man who is considered to have divine authority over the life and death of every Roman citizen is about reinforcing a capitalist view of individual property rights? Probably not. The man, like every other professor at good old PU, is operating in bad faith. But this is the real question raised by PragerU's video. Not just, was Jesus a socialist, but whether or not that question even makes sense. I'm a Christian socialist, and if you were to ask me if Jesus were a socialist, I'd say of course not. The notion of applying the principles of free market capitalism versus worker ownership to the means of production to 1st century Roman Judea is laughable. When Reed argues that Jesus never calls for a big government welfare state, he's acting as though that were even a possibility. Of course, Jesus didn't say,
"Have it taxed by politicians to fund a welfare bureaucracy."
He didn't live under a representative government. In this video, and in the essay that it's based on, Reed talks about the state and profit and capital in modern post-industrial terms, and acts as though Jesus' teachings are solely relevant to the material conditions that exist under our current form of the state.
Nowhere in the New Testament does he advocate for the government to punish the rich or even to use tax money to help the poor. Nor does he promote the ideas of state ownership of businesses or central planning of the economy.
Jesus was a spiritual leader and a member of the Jewish community who existed as the subject of an empire. His teachings are not simply moral lessons, but are religious ones which presuppose the existence of the Jewish God and the truth of the Jewish prophets. And they're concerned with immaterial matters such as the nature of the eternal soul and one's relationship to God. His sole relation to the state was to live under it, be tried by it, and be killed by it. He lived 1,300 years before anything remotely resembling the forerunners to the rudimentary form of the systems that would become capitalism. And to argue that his ministry is or is not an endorsement of a specific form of post-industrial economic organization is to miss the point entirely. As Marxist and atheist critic Terry Eagleton argues in his essay, The Scum of the Earth, the advanced capitalist system is inherently atheistic. It is godless in its actual material practices and in the values and beliefs implicit in them. A society of packaged fulfillment, administered desire, managerialized politics, and consumerist economics is unlikely to cut to the kind of depth where theological questions can even be properly raised. How can one look at a system like government-sanctioned free market capitalism, driven by rational self-interest, and see anything resembling the teachings of this irrational, self-destroying prophet of love and fury? To look to the radical message of the Gospels and say, Jesus doesn't like it when people are poor, therefore he'd like capitalism because I think it makes people less poor, is to ignore all the love and anger and radicalism within them. If we want to apply those lessons to economics at all, the questions are what ethical code we are supposed to take away from those teachings and how we can put those ethics into practice. And that's a question that Reed avoids entirely.
Sell all of your jewelry and give it to the poor, so they laid Jesus Christ in his grave.
Reed offers a definition of one form of socialism in his video.
Socialism is the concentration of power into the hands of government elites to achieve the following purposes: central planning of the economy and the radical redistribution of wealth. Jesus never called for any of that.
And he offers some examples of things that socialists apparently say about Jesus, but oddly, he doesn't quote them. So let's get some prominent socialists in the mix, so we can at least see this philosophy which Reed says no one who believes in and understands the gospel would follow. First, there's prominent American socialist Bernie Sanders. I am often criticized for constantly attacking the rich. Yes, because the rich are constantly attacking the poor. Then, if you want something more old-fashioned, Karl Marx once laid out the class struggle and need for a revolution by saying that this social order with its pauperism, famines, prisons, gallows, armies, and wars is necessary to society, that still greater disaster would ensue if this organization were destroyed. All this is said only by those who profit by this organization, while those who suffer from it, and they are 10 times as numerous, think and say quite the contrary. If you want someone a little more mainstream, the kind of academic communist PragerU is supposed to be an antidote to, here's Noam Chomsky. A true revolution of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. With righteous indignation it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the wealth investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say, this is not just. Finally, to represent a big government statist just like Reed writes about, here's Vladimir Lenin writing about the need to seize farmland and collectivize it. How many thousands, tens of thousands, are in prison for petty theft, while the robber barons of our day get away with murder? Literally murder, accessories to murder. Property is theft, Proudhon wrote. The coat that hangs in your closet belongs to the poor. The house you don't live in, your empty buildings, belong to the poor. Property is theft. So that's the big government tyrannical socialism, which no educated and thoughtful Christian could ever see the Bible as supporting. Even Lawrence Reed, a man without any professional or educational background in theology, can see that. Yeah, you guessed the joke. Those people didn't say those things. Those were, respectively, John Chrysostom, an archbishop of Constantinople who lived within 100 years of Rome legalizing Christianity, Leo Tolstoy, author of War and Peace and a devout Christian considered one of the forefathers of Christian anarchism, the Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King Jr., who, unlike Reed, had a PhD in theology, and Dorothy Day, founder of the Catholic Worker Movement and current candidate for sainthood. All of these people either were socialists or articulated ideas that we would recognize as socialist, and all of them had a greater understanding and professional experience with Christian theology than, well, just about anyone. So why isn't this brought up? And the answer to that, I feel, is far more interesting than just the fact that it makes Reed look silly. Because PragerU's approach, once you've watched their videos, can't ever accommodate actual engagement with an opposing viewpoint. If you watch most left-wing videos, like Sean's or Three Arrows, you'll see that they're rigorous in citing the arguments that they debunk, even when it means having to listen to Stefan Molyneux's awful voice.
Ray roundly condemns Finn for his cowardice, making that scornful World War I lemon white feather face that indicates a complete denial of egg accessibility.
The way that PragerU and other conservative voices operate, though, is to state what the left believes and then give you some answers that sound common sense. It's not just strawmanning, where they make up a ridiculous argument that they claim their opponent supports. They also make up the opponents themselves. Reed is entirely focused on rebutting imagined liberals citing scripture piecemeal, rather than engaging with any kind of actual ideology. To acknowledge that there is a centuries-old movement of people for whom socialism and Christianity are intertwined wouldn't just mean engaging with arguments that are better informed than Reed. It would turn what is supposed to be a huge win in the marketplace of ideas into an actual debate. It would mean acknowledging there are people on the left who come to their positions through actual scholarship, conviction, and inquiry. The core of PragerU's bad faith arguments isn't just that they're glib and dishonest about what they believe. It's that they operate with the assumption that everyone with a political opinion is equally insincere and uninformed. Reed isn't just making shoddy arguments because he doesn't know any better. He has to make shoddy arguments because it is dependent on the conservative project to represent their opponents as weak enough to be defeated with a minimum of effort. So now, it's time to learn what PragerU doesn't want you to know. For example, Reed would have to admit that almost no Christian socialist since the modern conception of the nation-state has been primarily committed to the kind of socialism he describes, in which a state run by a party representing the working class redistributes wealth through taxation and appropriation. The vast majority of Christian socialists from about 1600 AD on have been anarchists or close to it, and by ignoring this fact, Reed ends up making their argument for them. The fact is that a lot of Christian socialists have believed that, as Tolstoy wrote, Christianity in its true sense must mean the end of government. As the role of a state includes the funding of a military, the defense of borders through the threat of force, and the enforcement of laws, just or unjust, through the legal application of state violence, many Christians over the centuries have considered subservience to or endorsement of the state to be incompatible with Jesus' messages of forgiveness and nonviolence. If, as the Bible says, we should not kill, we should not punish, we should turn our backs on war and put away our weapons, how do we justify participation in a system which does this with our money and in our name? The answers can vary, whether it's the Quaker tradition of conscientious objection to military service, or Catholic anarchist Ammon Hennessy living below the poverty line so that he wouldn't pay taxes to fund the military. But what Reed fails to realize is that his argument is one that many Christian socialists would support, except he fails in one major way. As a libertarian capitalist, Reed conceives of private property as a fundamental right, similar to one's right to speech, to bodily autonomy, and to freedom from violence. In an essay earlier this year, Reed says that alongside the right to free thought and freedom from violence, you have a right to material property that you are freely given, that you created yourself or that you freely traded for, and that you don't have a right to free stuff in general unless the rightful owner chooses to offer it. We run into two issues here, both of which are matters addressed by Christian socialists. The first is that property rights are fundamentally different from those others, which are located in the body and the mind. To stop me speaking, someone must physically silence me. To deny my bodily autonomy, someone must physically restrain me. To deny my property, someone must take my stuff, probably while I'm not there or not looking. You can argue the libertarian position that I worked with my body for money, then spent that money to buy something, and thus my toothbrush or my Xbox is like a part of my body through a metaphysical transference of the self, of course. But that's always struck me as a fairly shaky chain of logic, and in its absence, you're left with the fact that Reed and other libertarians believe that one of the only legitimate uses of state violence is to protect your stuff. Personally, I don't think that the notion that asking the government to send a cop over to threaten to shoot a man dead if he tries to steal my TV is compatible with a religion of pacifism and forgiveness. As the left-wing anthropologist David Graeber argues, property is not really a relation between a person and a thing. It is an understanding or arrangement between people concerning things. My ownership over my property is not a mystical bond which exists in isolation. It comes into being by a common understanding that I own it. The fact is, there is no property without the state to enforce its ownership. I can demonstrate my right to speaking by speaking, but I can only demonstrate my ownership of land via the state-issued deed and calling upon government force to remove people who trespass on it. And if one views the coercive power of a state as fundamentally violent, one must also view the existence of private property itself as contingent upon violence.
The bankers and the preachers, they nailed him on a cross, and they laid Jesus Christ in his grave.
I think that one of the greatest and most radically communist Christian arguments against capital and private property comes from Gerard Winstanley, an English Quaker radical of the mid-17th century, writing 200 years before Marx. In 1649, after King Charles lost the English Civil War and also his head, and before Cromwell was made Lord Protector and did a genocide to the Irish, Winstanley led the Diggers, one of many groups of Christians calling for a new order in England. Winstanley's argument was simple. People were hungry, the nobles had land they did nothing with, and if the king could be overthrown, then surely we had to admit the whole idea of nobility was worth tossing out if it meant people starving. And so he and his followers took to the private lands of the idle rich, dug them up, and planted crops, which they intended to give out free to all who needed them. Winstanley's core belief was a radical one, built on simple Christian ethics. The earth, which was made to be a common treasury of relief for all, both beasts and men, was hedged into enclosures by the teachers and rulers, and the others were made servants and slaves. And that earth that is within this creation made a common storehouse for all is bought and sold, and kept in the hands of a few, whereby the great Creator is mightily dishonored, as if he were a respecter of persons, delighting in the comfortable livelihoods of some, and rejoicing in the miserable poverty and straits of others. From the beginning it was not so. Just as the Quakers famously would not tip their hats to their social betters, believing that God intended all men to be equal, so Winstanley argued that systems which created wealth and poverty and gave some men the power to employ others imposed a hierarchy never intended by God. Winstanley's argument is not simply that the rich have an obligation to help the poor, but that the classes of rich and poor should be abolished. It was not an uncommon argument that the institution of monarchy was in some way sinful or idolatrous. John Milton, a much more moderate radical than Winstanley, makes it a cornerstone of Paradise Lost. Winstanley's argument, though, that financial power is fundamentally indistinct from other forms of state power, that to own the means of production or have the ability to employ laborers makes one a member of a ruling class just as surely as noble birth does, is one predating the modern conception of communism by centuries and based not on a liberal notion of human rights, but on the Christian belief in universal equality, that all people are branches on the same tree or members of the same body. Winstanley's argument also cuts to what I feel is one of the best arguments against the libertarian conception of property rights, as his entire political mission was focused on the enclosure of the commons. In Winstanley's time, these were lands that were considered to be common property but had, over time, passed into private hands and been enclosed. This is a process that accelerated after the Norman invasion of 1066, which further entrenched the power of the noble class and the monarchy. However, the process Winstanley speaks to, by which property held in common slowly passes into the hands of the ruling class, is something that's become a hallmark of capitalism. You can see it in the way that industrial-scale cattle companies claimed land in the American West, in the way that Thatcher privatized state industries, in the way that the Resnick family essentially owned California's water system. Winstanley's argument, though, is a broader view on this, which has been echoed by many economic theorists since him. This process of enclosure, in some way or another, applies to all property beyond just common lands. As libertarian academic Matt Swilinski argues, if I put a fence around a piece of land that had previously been open to all to use, claim it as my own, and announce to all that I will use violence against any who walk upon it without my consent, it would certainly appear as though I am the one initiating force, or at least the threat of force, against others. I am restricting their liberty to move about as they were once free to do. I am doing so by threatening them with physical violence unless they comply with my demands. To claim a property right is to claim the right to use physical force to prevent other people from using a resource without your consent. And it is not quite clear why the fact that you went and mixed your labor with some piece of land should suffice to give you that right. None of the raw materials, land, crops, or other goods used to create wealth came into existence already owned by one individual. None of us came out of the womb with the deed to a factory in our hands. Everything at some point belonged to either everyone or no one, and however long ago it may have been, the passage of time does not legitimize that original theft. Winstanley's argument in this case, by the way, is one that I think is very powerful rhetoric if applied to the debate over reparations for American slavery. Even if Reed is correct when saying that you have an inherent right to property freely given or purchased, then we butt up against the fact that there is very, very little of value on this earth we can say was freely given to its original private owners. Thus, the threat of violence needed to maintain property ownership is not simply one of defending your possessions. It is an ongoing threat by which the inheritors of stolen goods keep them from their rightful place in collective hands. As Winstanley once again argued, your buying and selling of land, and the fruits of it one to another, is the cursed thing, and was brought in by war, which hath and still does establish murder and theft in the hands of some branches of mankind over others, which is the greatest outward burden and unrighteous power that the creation groans under. For the power of enclosing land and owning property was brought into creation by your ancestors by the sword, which first did murder their fellow creatures, men, and after plunder or steal away their land, and left this land successively to you, their children. And therefore, though you did not kill or thieve, you hold that cursed thing in your hand by the power of the sword. Surely that righteous Creator who is King did never ordain that unless some of mankind do bring that mineral, silver and gold, in their hands, to others of their own kind, that they should neither be fed nor be clothed. No, surely, for this was the project of tyrant flesh, which landlords are branches of, to set his image upon money. This is exciting stuff, people. It's 1649, and drawing from no text but the Bible, we have a fully formed theory that the ruling class is defined by their inherently unjust ownership of resources rather than by rank in society. Winstanley is synthesizing the Christian Gospel's preaching against wealth hoarding and violence to articulate the notion that the existence of a moneyed class in a time of poverty is, in and of itself, an ongoing act of violence. The concept of a standing professional army is less than 10 years old in England, and this 40-year-old tailor is already telling folks there's no war but class war. People arguing against the concept of Christian socialism will often claim that the commandment, "Thou shalt not steal," is meant to delineate the existence of private property, but Winstanley turns that on its head, arguing that if we oppose theft, if we oppose violence, we must be unwilling to tolerate the theft and violence which created the private property system. Reed says Jesus would never endorse the government violently taking people's money away. How, then, can we possibly believe that Jesus would endorse landowners and capital owners and the owning class as a whole robbing us of our labor and our commons? This is why Christian socialism is a coherent ideology, and one that Reed can't simply banish away with a few poorly thought-out citations. It is not a matter of delineating basic social welfare policies and tax structure and then, as Reed does for capitalism, finding a handful of Bible verses which justify them. Like other forms of socialism, it is the adoption of a certain worldview and a set of ethics with which the very fundamental nature of capitalism that Reed espouses is incompatible. Christian socialists are not just, as Reed portrays them, Bernie Sanders fans trying to win an argument by citing the Bible. It is a complex and eternally consistent political theology which predates Marx and Locke and Adam Smith by centuries. So no, PragerU, Jesus was not a socialist. Jesus was, or at least is presented in the Bible as, a man preoccupied almost entirely with the human soul rather than political action. However, when I try and live by the moral code he teaches, the only political actions I can imagine that I think would make Jesus happy are ones that make me a socialist. I'm not saying that you, my viewer, have to be a Christian. I'm not saying you have to be a socialist. Among the Christians and socialists in my personal life, I'm the only one I know of in both camps. Unlike Lawrence Reed, I would never pretend to have a definitive and perfect understanding of theology that proves that my political beliefs are the only ones vindicated by God. But to argue that nobody could read the Bible as an endorsement of socialist principles isn't just to misunderstand both socialism and Christianity, but to misunderstand the role of religion in human life as a set of guiding principles, a network of ethics and poetry and mysteries that push you to aim for impossible goals. As Dorothy Day said, "We are not expecting utopia here on this earth, but God meant things to be much easier than we have made them." Christian socialism is not, as Reed would argue, just thinking Jesus wants you to tax the rich more. It's looking at the fairly clear message of what the kingdom of heaven should be and realizing what the best tools to build it on earth are. It's the belief that when Jesus said that what we do for the poor and the imprisoned we do for him, he wasn't saying he'd want to be forced to stamp license plate for pennies or kicked out into the street because giving him a home would mean raising taxes. It is the belief that we are all one human body and that this body should be fed and sheltered and kept healthy. And I do have one parting word for Reed, who I'm sure is paid handsomely in his think tank job.
But you can be kind to other people and be a capitalist. John D. Rockefeller probably gave away more money than anyone in human history, and he was certainly a capitalist. Bill Gates and Warren Buffett have given away millions, too.
I would presume that any moral evaluation of John D. Rockefeller would include some responsibility for the Ludlow massacre, in which the National Guard, at his company's request, put down a strike and killed 21 people, including 8 children, starting a labor war in which 75 additional people died. While $10 billion is a lot of money to anyone but Rockefeller, who was worth $400 billion adjusted for inflation, we'd be wise to keep in mind the lesson in Matthew chapter 27, verse 3. When Judas, who had betrayed him, saw that Jesus was condemned, he was seized with remorse and returned the 30 silver coins to the chief priests and the elders. "I have sinned," he said, "for I have betrayed innocent blood." "What is that to us?" they replied. "That is your responsibility." So Judas threw the money into the temple and left. Then he went away and hanged himself. The chief priests picked up the coins and said, "It is against the law to put this into the treasury, since it is blood money."
But you can be kind to other people and be a capitalist. John D. Rockefeller probably gave away more money than anyone in human history, and he was certainly a capitalist.
Or, as the old song about the diggers goes, "You poor take courage, you rich take care."
In 1649, to St. George's Hill, a ragged band they call the Diggers came to show the people's will. They defy the landlords, they defy the law. They were the dispossessed, reclaiming what was ours. "We come in peace," they said, "to dig and sow. We come to work the land in common and to make the waste ground grow. This earth divided we will make whole, so it can be a common treasury for all. The sin of property we do disdain. No one has any right to buy and sell the earth for private gain. By theft and murder they steal the land. Now everywhere the walls rise up at their command. They make the laws to chain us well. The preachers dazzle us with heaven, or they damn us into hell. We will not worship the God they serve, the God of greed who feeds the rich while poor folks starve. To work and eat together, we need no swords. We will not bow to the masters or pay rent to landlords. Still we're free people, though we are poor. Y'all diggers all stand up for glory, stand up now. From the men of property, the order came. They sent the hired men and troopers to wipe out the diggers' claim, tear down their cottages, destroy their corn. They were dispersed, but still the vision carries on. Y'all poor take courage, y'all rich take care. This earth was made a common treasury for everyone to share. All things in common, all people one. We come in peace, the order came to cut them down.
Hi everyone, thanks for watching my video. I just wanted to record a short postscript here to thank my patrons and donors. As you saw in the credits, I've got a Patreon. I also have a Ko-fi link that'll appear on the screen right about now. If you want to support me monthly, I'd recommend the Patreon, but if you can't afford to, or if you don't want to necessarily pay for every video, just the ones you like, Ko-fi is fine. So far, the biggest impact from Patreon has been to allow me to join the IWWFJU, that's the Freelance Journalists Union. Got the red card and everything. So know that by supporting me, you are also helping to support actual journalists and other content creators who need union representation. The FJU fights for things like overdue payment, warning people about abusive work situations, and other situations which are unique to freelance creators like myself and people who actually do this for a full-time living. Currently, we're about $5 a month away from the next Patreon goal, which is going to be to establish a monthly newsletter. It'll have some thoughts on video games. I know I didn't talk about it in this video, but if you're new to the channel, a lot of the stuff I do is game-related. It'll also include some general things that aren't long enough or deep enough to make video subjects. I did want to thank everyone for sticking around. You can find me on Twitter at the link below. If you do have any questions about the topics raised in this video, I'll answer them to the best of my ability. And if you just want to follow me for my great posts, you're welcome to as well. Again, thank you everyone for watching. I know some people have felt skeptical about self-identified Christian socialists or Christian communists, so I did want to get some stuff on the record at the end here when it's not part of the main content. Abortion is a human right, as is birth control. They should both be free, accessible, and available to everyone. Trans and other LGBT people are completely valid in their identities and deserve equal rights, and I don't think hell is real, and I definitely don't think any of you are going there. If you want to make sure you don't go to hell, support me on Patreon. Thank you for your time, everyone. I really do appreciate it. Bye.